Israel, stressing that it won't be able to restrain the Israelis in how they respond. This is according to a U.S. official and a former Israeli official briefed on the matter. But Iran's rhetoric as to possible retaliation has become increasingly threatening in recent days. And joining us now is contributing writer at The Atlantic, Arash Azizi. I mean, what kind of response could we expect from Iran within the realm of its current capabilities at this point? Does it even have the ability to exact a serious attack on Israel at this point?
It has an ability to mount some sort of an attack on Israel. The main thing that will deter it is not really just its lack of capabilities, but the reality of how severe Israeli response can be. As in, there are many in Israel and the Israeli establishment who might want to attack on Iran's economic center, on its, let's say, an attack on Iran's oil refineries that could be truly disastrous. Not to mention even some sort of a attack on the leadership of different military organizations in Iran. So I think the main thing that will hold Iran back is A, the kind of response it could get from Israel, and B, the kind of pressures that it could have from the United States that has increased its military pressure. There is a very intense debate in the Iranian establishment as to the timing and severity of the attack. And it appears that Khamenei, the supreme leader, who usually called, has the last word on such affairs, even he has become divided. He speaks in sort of from both sides of his mouth on the issue. And different Iranian officials, like even though they were now mostly, in the last couple of days since Khamenei spoke, they're mostly speaking of a crushing response. We saw that President Masoud Pezeshkian, for example, a couple of hours earlier said that yes, Israel will get a crushing response, but if there is a ceasefire in Lebanon, the form of response will differ. And if Israel changes its behavior, the form of response will differ. And of course, there's also the messages that the United States and Israel sent to Iran indirectly through countries like Turkey. All of that will have a role in determining what kind of response Iranians are to give.
Why has the rhetoric changed? I mean, the Islamic Republic was initially much softer in its threats against Israel following that Israeli retaliatory strike on its military infrastructure. And suddenly we've, seen a much more aggressive approach from Iran.
It's just been a few days. I know that sort of the media narrative is that the response changed a lot. It's been just a few days, but I think what I think the important element here is that there are some in the Iranian establishment, some sort of strategic thinkers in Iran generally, regardless of what kind of general views they have on Israel or Iran's policy. They believe that if Iran shows too much weakness in vis-a-vis Israel, it might invite an Israeli attack. It's not a very hard logic to see because, for example, after the Israeli attack on Iran, even when Iran appeared to not want to respond, there were reports in the Israeli media that, for example, Israel was thinking about a response to Hezbollah's alleged sort of assassination attempt at Prime Minister Netanyahu's house in Caesarea in Israel. So, the idea was that, well, if Iran just shows the weakness and says that it's not going to attack, it will actually invite Israeli attacks. Maybe Israel will see this as a golden opportunity to say, well, if Iran is not going to do anything, we're going to attack some nuclear sites, for example. So I think that's the sort of internal conversation that means that sometimes it pushes the sort of those who speak in one way or the other, but they can also be pushed back again. So just because Iran is saying we're going to give a crushing response, it doesn't matter that it doesn't mean that it necessarily will do so. And changes every day with the kind of messages that, again, are going from Israel and from the United States to Iran. The Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan, for example, has spoken openly about being a go-between. Turkey, of course, speaks to both Israel and the United States, so it will be able to get very direct messages of the consequences that Iranians will have to face, from Israel.
Right. Obviously, the decision that Israel made not to attack Iranian nuclear facilities back in its retaliatory strike was one that was condemned by many different, you could say, supporters of the Israeli state, but also really those who are very worried about Iran's future nuclear capabilities. In the case that we would see Iran strike back against Israel, do you think that Israel's going to change its tune and then strike nuclear facilities as a result of that?
I think it's quite possible that Israel will attack Iran's nuclear capacities at some point. The taboo of direct Israeli strikes on Iran has been broken. It's now something that you can do. It's something that has been done. And it's also not a secret that Iran very openly is considering changing its nuclear doctrine, i.e., attempting to build a nuclear weapon. Well, I think it's sort of a many people know that Israel probably is not able to destroy the Iranian nuclear program the way it did under the Begin Doctrine to Iraq and Syria in previous years. That's because the Iranian nuclear program is much more advanced, it's much more dispersed, it's much more underground, but it can still bring serious damage to it and put it back for a couple of years. So I think it's not at all unlikely that it will take that decision at some point, or that if it's not going to take that decision, all of this can be sort of a part of a negotiation. Like, we have to wait. Of course, in 2 days there are U.S. presidential elections. Some reports said that Iran is going to attack before the U.S. presidential elections. They will determine a lot of things. But I'll tell you this: no matter who sits in the White House, they're going to have to talk to Iran. They're going to talk to Iran, even if the Republican president Donald Trump is back. There's going to be some talking to Iran, because stepping back from the brink of this all-out conflict is something that is in the sort of interest of everybody in the region and both parties in the United States. So I think we might see that at some point. But before we get to a place where indirect negotiations basically can take care of the matter, I think it's not at all unlikely for Israel to want to attack the nuclear sites in Iran. Again, it's noteworthy that the opposition leaders in Israel from both left and right of Netanyahu, Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid, basically wanted him to hit Iran harder than he has. And it's also a chip on Netanyahu's shoulder. It goes back to many times in the past where he went very close to hitting. And even in those previous times, we know that, again, leaders who were to his left, someone like Ehud Barak, who is a very left-wing leader by Israeli standards. He at some point, I think, had advocated hitting Iran when he served as Minister of Defense in previous coalition government. So there would be a lot of pressure on Netanyahu, and not just from usual suspects like his current far-right coalition partners, but even from opposition parties on all sides.
What kind of rhetoric are we hearing from the Iranian public? Obviously, following Israel's retaliatory strikes, only targeting military infrastructure, there was perhaps, the question if we were going to see a public reckoning from the Iranian people to stand up against the Islamic regime, saying, okay, Israel clearly isn't targeting us, they're targeting you. But we haven't really seen kind of a mass wave in responses to this. What do you think is going to happen from here?
Frankly, those who predicted this sort of, there would be some sort of a mass uprising when Israel attacks and all that, frankly, they were a bit delusional. I mean, a mass uprising in which you come and bring down the government. Iranians have tried this many times in the past. They've been brutally killed. They don't have the sort of enough organization. So it's not like something that can just happen just like that. Also, an Iranian civilian was killed in the attacks, as were 4 Iranian soldiers, many of whom were ordinary Iranians who were serving in military posts. So I think the idea that, attacks will somehow not hurt the country or the people at all are also some sort of delusion, although one that is shared by some Iranians. Look, I'll say this. Iranians don't want war. They don't want war with Israel. We have no reason as a country to have war with Israel. We don't have a border with Israel. We're not party to the Arab-Israeli conflict. We as a country, there's not the sort of a pervasive anti-Israel sentiment. If you look at the last year, there has been popular anti-Israeli protests in around the world, in New York where I live, in obviously all over the region, but you don't have that in Iran. Regime staged demonstrations of a few hundred people, yes, but you don't really have there's not a mass anti-Israel sentiment in Iran. So Iranians don't want war with Israel. And also many even in the Iranian establishment know that a war with Israel is foolishness for Iran, is bringing Iran into a war with a powerful state like Israel and the United States, and they want to avoid that. And I think, there should be the pressure of Iranians on their own regime to drop the anti-Israel crusade and give up its foolish plan to want to fight Israel, because it can be very dangerous for Iran.
All right, Aziz, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us on Zoom from the United States.